Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everybody. That was just wonderful. What I really liked about it was that it wasn't fatalistic. I think everybody pointed to a path moving forward in some way, uh, which was wonderful. And I think it speaks to the need for a national wildfire strategy where we involved Indigenous communities, the business communities, the provinces, the national parks. Jane, you're working with the province because the province borders the national parks. There has to be some kind of coordination. And one thing I really liked about what Sophie talked about was this the super moss that may solve a lot of our problems. Tell us a little bit more about sphagnum and why is it so super?
Well, yeah, especially when we're talking about peatland wildfires. Sphagnum is actually a genus of moss, so there's lots of different species of this sphagnum moss. But what it has in common is that it's very, very good at holding on to moisture. It can actually hold 400 times its own weight in water. And so in a fire-prone landscape, a moss such as that can have really, impactful ways to change wildfire behavior. So it's the structure of the moss, and when we sort of can promote the conditions that grow on the ground surface, it protects whatever's underneath it from fire. And so that's one reason why it's so super. It also stores a lot of carbon. I think it's the genus of plant that stores the most carbon of any in the world. So it's really important that we figure out how to best promote it and maintain it on the landscape.
One more question: can we grow it?
Yeah, there are ways. People are working on trying to grow it in sort of laboratories and greenhouses, but it's so slow growing, which is one of its sort of key benefits, really, that it is so slow growing and so slow to decay also. But what we are doing in some of the peatlands, if they've become non-sphagnum dominated, there's things you can do to try and shift them back into a sphagnum dominated state. So removing some of the trees, opening up that canopy to let the light in is actually really good for sphagnum moss. As well as if peatlands are disturbed, you can re-wet them, so block any ditches or create pools in them to create wetter surface conditions, which of course the mosses really like.
Stephanie, one thing that I thought maybe you could comment on is we know that there's incredible psychological challenges associated, especially with First Nations community, which represent, I think, only 4% of the population, but 50% of the evacuations. But can you talk a little bit more about the toxicity of smoke from fire?
Sure, Ed. Well, so that wasn't something that our research team had looked at, but we do. It did come up a lot in our qualitative research with Indigenous residents and communities, where they spoke about their concern around the lingering smoke in the air. And so that was something that really was of grave concern to a number of Indigenous communities and residents. And so they spoke about how that they felt that their health had changed following the wildfire, that their and access to healthcare services at that time proved to be a challenge or barrier, just because of the discontinuation of services during the immediate evacuation. So they were concerned about respiratory health problems during that time, and that concern also resulted among parents as well, who were concerned for their elderly parents and children and youth who are most vulnerable.
Now, can we make these communities more resilient? Having community centers with filters where people can go to at times where there's an awful lot of smoke. Are there immediate things that we can do?
Those are certainly some examples from what we know about in many of the Indigenous communities is having the resources to set something like that up. So that's something that I think a lot of communities are trying to find innovative ways of addressing some of the longer term impacts, such as from that result from fires like smoke, that impact their physical health. But we have to keep in mind that many of the communities that are located there, they are located in more vulnerable, disaster-prone areas where they experience a number of inequities in terms of resources that sometimes prevent some of implementing some of those more resilient or adaptive technologies or equipment.
Speaking of stress, Jane, you must have one of the most stressful jobs in Parks Canada. You've got two things. One is that you've got the possibility of prescribed burn getting out of control, which has happened in Jasper National Park with the Syncline fire many, many years ago. Thankfully, that was contained. But then you have also the prospect of hundreds of thousands of people in the park faced with the potential wildfire that gets out of control. How do you cope with it?
Well, I guess like coping with the stress is like anybody trying to be mindful. But I guess in the scope of my job, I think it's all about the preparedness and all the planning that goes into all the things that I talked about. So, when we're doing prescribed fires, definitely, there's a level of risk there that because we rely on the weather so much that we can't completely take the risk out. But with, the years of planning that goes into each prescribed fire and the careful monitoring of the weather conditions under which we light them and all the training we give to our staff in order to contain them where we want them, that can kind of like make it as least stressful as possible. And we are ready for any contingencies. With the community here, we do have a really great working relationship with the town of Banff Fire Department. We do lots of emergency preparedness training. We do talk to the public a lot about, what our emergency response plans are and how the community can help if those types of natural disasters occur. And we do a lot of training scenarios where we kind of simulate wildfires and figure out how we're going to organize ourselves, what we're going to do. And so it's all about preparedness. So you take as much of the uncertainty out as you can so that you kind of reserve a stress for that piece that you can't get rid of.
So you've learned by example as well, is that the Kenow fire in Waterton was, I think, will go down in history as a textbook response to a impending wildfire. I know it didn't happen in Banff, but I'm sure you know very much about it. Maybe the public would be interested in this fire because it was really significant and it turned out to be successful in almost every order of response. Can you tell us a little bit about that fire?
Mm-hmm. So again, it wasn't in Banff, but it was in Waterton Lakes National Park. I did go down as one of the Unified Incident Commanders of that fire shortly after the main event, which was a very large wind-driven fire that moved through Waterton Lakes National Park, a substantial proportion of the park. It was significant in size in that it covered the majority of the area that is protected by Waterton Lakes National Park, but also that there is a community within that park as well. And the incident management team evacuated that community well in advance. They held public meetings to inform homeowners of activities they could do ahead of time. The former fire management officer had spent a decade or more conducting fire smart and fuel management treatments around the community, much like we do around Banff. And all of those things combined allowed for the incident management team that was there on the evening that the big fire rolled through to ensure that both the responders and the public were safe, that the public was already evacuated by the time the fire came through, and that the firefighters that were there had the best chance of suppressing the fire and limiting loss in that community.
I think a testament to that is I was in there shortly after, and all of the people living in the town sites had signs up in front of their house and on the streets thanking Parks Canada for doing such a great job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that that came out of that, and I'll ask all of you perhaps to answer, was that a year or so after the Kenow fire, we saw how fire can affect not just air quality, but water quality. And Cameron Falls, if anybody's been to Waterton, it's just in the town site, and it's a beautiful waterfall that flows crystal clear year round. But after a thunderstorm, it just turned absolutely black. And I think this is one of the more frightening things that we see as a possibility, is that fire may affect our drinking water quality, or our drinking water. Sophie or Stephanie, do you want to weigh in on that? I know peat is such a great purifier, and without peat, there's really nothing to absorb that carbon.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Ed. So after fire, when a lot of the peat or soil, sort of the organic matter in the soils, has been combusted, and all of that above ground vegetation and their roots as well, that really act to anchor the soil in place. Once they've been burned, you usually get like a big spike in erosion and a lot of sediment transport, which can move down into waterways. And especially with respect to peat, sometimes what happens in particularly more severe fires is that the surface of the peat becomes hydrophobic. So instead of your precipitation infiltrating down into the soil and taking a nice slow path and getting purified, as you say, filtered on the way, it doesn't happen like that. It runs right off the surface and picks up whatever it can in its path. And we did see after the Fort McMurray fire, for example, a big spike in the treatment cost of water, because you had so much sediment and dissolved organic carbon entering the waterways that would normally be locked up in those ecosystems.
Jane, I think you wanted to weigh in, but following that, we also have a question from a viewer. So you want to talk a little bit about watershed protection?
Yeah, so one of the ways that prescribed fire can help in terms of the water quality kind of challenge is that because we can plan prescribed fires for a specific type or ecological objective or a lower to moderate severity fire, we can use that to protect watersheds. So if you imagine wildfires occurring during drought conditions, there is the possibility that an entire watershed could be taken out by a large wildfire. If we do strategically placed prescribed fires to break up some of that, the forest in those watersheds, we can maybe limit the extent and impact of future wildfires by breaking up that landscape.
And we've seen examples of it. At Sydney, the Canberra fires had built a new water treatment plant. Fort Collins was nearly knocked out. I think Fort McMurray now is spending 2 or 3 times the amount they need to on treating water quality because of all the carbon that's coming down the Athabasca River. But we have one question from a viewer for you, Jane, and that is, are planned burns limited to 50% of historical norms due to politics, resource availability, or for social reasons?
All of the above plus more. So we aim for 50% because of, it does take a lot of planning. Also, we do allow for those managed wildfires to play their natural role. So the expectation is that between wildfires that we can carefully manage for public safety and prescribed fire, that we might achieve or start to achieve close to the historic 50 or fire cycle. That being said, it is quite difficult to plan and pull these off. I'm currently monitoring what's going on with that prescribed fire I had in my presentation. We lit it on Friday, and so we just have to seize those opportunities. But in a year like this, where it was quite rainy in Canada, we weren't sure that we would get an opportunity to conduct the prescribed fires, and so we kind of just have to be ready when the landscape is, and that doesn't always happen. So 50% is a reasonable goal given, the complications of safety, political support, the public support, and weather.
Here's a question from another viewer that I get asked all the time, and I can weigh in on this one as well, but I'll let you 3 take the first stab at it. What actions can everyday people take to help minimize the unprecedented dangers of wildfire? It could be related to prevention or the aftermath in the long term or the short term. Well, how about me then? I think there's so many things you can do if you're living, you're living in some place like Kelowna in a forested community. You can make your own place fire smart. I'm looking out my window right now, and I live overlooking the Saskatchewan River in Edmonton, and I've got 4 giant spruce trees in front of my house, 2 beautiful ornamental junipers, and the house is wood, the fence is wood. If there's a fire that goes into the river valley, I'm probably hooped, and so is my neighbor because he's got cedar shake shingles. So I think, we can all look at ourselves and say, how resilient are we when it comes to fire? That's certainly one thing you can do, is just have a look at your surroundings. And if you really feel uncomfortable, there are fire smart programs that you can look at online that will help you go through the different steps that you can take. Some of them, will cost you. Some are fairly simple. But I think that the other thing that I would say, that I've said many times in the past, I think that with the National Wildfire Strategy, we've got to have incentives put in place so that people can make themselves more resilient to fire. Banff is lucky because they've got talented people like Jane. They've got a really good fire department. But if you go to a place like Salt Spring Island, which is entirely forested, exactly the same size as Waterton National Park, and it's heavily forested, and the only way off the island is by ferry. What do you do there if a fire roars through? They don't have the tax base, basically, to be able to make themselves more resilient. So I think that we've got to start shifting some of the subsidies that we offer to, say, resource companies, and transfer them over to First Nations communities, for example, and small forested communities in Canada, to make them more resilient to fire. Stephanie, I see you nodding, so please jump in.
Mm-hmm. No, I was going to add something on the opposite spectrum relating to psychological health. And so one of the things that we learned, which wasn't so unique to the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, is a response to addressing health or mental health impacts. We know from the response and recovery phases after a disaster, and the immediacy of a disaster, it's about managing the spread of the wildfire, ensuring that everyone's safely evacuated and safely returning back home. And one of the things that we learned from the Fort McMurray wildfire is that our provincial and municipal health system or the municipality and provincial health system didn't respond to those mental health impacts until year 3 following the wildfire. So here you have residents 3 years post disaster, where we're starting to see an increase in mental health services and supports that are becoming available. Not to say that there weren't services available at the time, but there was funding that was allocated to ensuring that there were necessary mental health services and supports. So funding, let's say, to hire a mental health therapist who would go out into the communities 2 to 3 days a week. And again, we didn't see funding flow into allocate into those services to address mental health until 3 years after the fire. But really, those services and funding to address psychological stress need to be there from the beginning, from day one. And so I think that's something that we need to think about when we're looking at how to address the unprecedented impacts of a disaster, is ensuring that we're not just trying to deal with the response, the recovery, and trying to mitigate the spread, but we also need to pay attention to health and mental well-being as well, and ensuring that those residents are protected.
Another question from a viewer: this year's fire season is not too bad in Canada, and that's quite true. And it's a question that all three, maybe Jane, this is best for you, because I know that you rely on some of these indicators, but are there early indicators that can help predict the severity of fire seasons?
Yes and no. I always tell people when they ask me at the beginning of the fire season if I can predict what's going to happen, I ask how reliably people look at the weather and how far out they can see. But definitely there are, large scale climate patterns, El Niños large scale kind of global climate patterns that can help to sort of predict things. This year it was fairly wet here. We had a lot of kind of Arctic lows and things that brought a whole bunch of precipitation. But what that does is make the vegetation grow quickly and with more biomass, which then cures as we go into the fall, which can result in a higher fuel load and a potentially higher potential for wildfires in the fall. So we do look at kind of at the 10,000 foot level, those types of climate patterns. And then we start to look, more at the short and midterm atmospheric pressure gradients and things like that to try to figure out what's coming our way. And most fire managers and agencies are monitoring the weather pretty much on a daily basis. And for us, when we're going into prescribed fire, we're looking at it almost on an hourly basis. So we're kind of looking at it again at multiple scales to help us out.
Sophie, do you want to weigh in, or there's another question as well?
I'll speak quickly to the susceptibility of peatlands and predicting their vulnerability to wildfire in a given season. We normally work on an annual to multi-annual sort of scale when we're thinking about the peatland fires for the season. There's some regions, such as the Boreal Plains, that can undergo multi-annual year droughts. And so you know that if you're in a water deficit period, your peatlands might not have filled back up to their healthiest, wettest levels. And so especially if you get a small snowpack year, you're starting on a bit of a back foot with regard to peatlands because they'll be drier than expected. And that can lead to more severe fires in the spring, especially in Alberta and Western Canada.
And the next question is probably applied to you as well, is that a viewer asks, a lot of Northern Ontario's boreal forests with so much carbon holding peat, other than seeding it with sphagnum moss and prescribed fires, clearing, what other techniques can or will be applied to protect these forests? And this viewer suggests something that I think has been done in the past with some interesting results, and building canals through it possibly. I mean, is that an option? When we try to dig through a peatland?
Well, I would say maybe the most important first step would be to halt any disturbance of peatlands, because they're so good at keeping themselves wet when they're in a pristine state, that if you can protect them in their natural state, then you wouldn't need the additional measures. But as the viewer says, the seeding with sphagnum and the prescribed fires in the low severity season or conditions are really the best to maintain those forests and protect them and protect that carbon especially. But I do think moving forward, bigger, sort of maybe more mechanistic restoration techniques might be able to be brought in or be brought in. But for now, definitely sort of ditch blocking and restoring disturbed peatlands is highest up there on the list, along with conserving peatlands in their healthy states.
I could add in maybe one thing that's interesting is California is now looking at reintroducing beavers into the Sierra Nevadas and places like that, so that they can hold water back and recreate wetlands that have been drained. And I think this is one of the big challenges that we face right across the boreal forest, is that with a lot of resource development, a lot of residential building as well, is that we're draining peatlands, wetlands at an astonishing rate. And in doing so, we're making those areas more vulnerable to fire. Because usually in the past, and I think Stephanie and Jane, I'm sure you'll agree, is that a wetland is the best thing to stop a fire, certainly better than a water bomber. Jane, and that's a good question. How much does it cost to bring in a water bomber?
It depends on how much you use them, but regularly, millions of dollars goes into fire suppression. Often, you know, when you compare the costs of fire suppression to prescribed fire in terms of cost per hectare, it's orders of magnitude, you know, hundreds of dollars a hectare for prescribed fire to tens of thousands of dollars a hectare for wildfire. And so typically, you know, across most suppression agencies in North America, the wildfire suppression costs far outweigh the cost of prescribed fire, but the mitigative kind of benefits of prescribed fire kind of are the opposite to the impacts of wildfire. So it's definitely a balance there.
I'm sure you get this a lot, is that many people just assume that if you have enough water bombers and people on the ground, you can put out a fire without any problem. It's just not the case, is it?
No, because often the wildfires are happening during these drought periods, which are becoming more frequent and more severe. And so, you know, the suppression efforts that we have, you know, the primary thing for us is the protection of the public and our first responders. And so often what we're doing with our suppression efforts and aerial water techniques is to hold fires and give us the best chance to do some suppression before Mother Nature does it for us. Because often with these very large wildfires, no amount of human intervention will really put a stop to it. It's most often put out by a large precipitation event as opposed to human intervention.
I started off my talk with Indigenous burning and how the Europeans that arrived on the scene really tried to put a stop to it. Some people recognize its value, and now Parks Canada is certainly among the agencies in Canada that has recognized that light burning, controlled burning, whatever you want to call it, is really important. And I'll throw this one at you, Stephanie, is that one of the last things that I got to see was in Teslin in the Yukon, where the First Nations there were basically fire smarting their community and selling the merchantable timber at a profit, but also using all of the snags and the slash to power their boilers. So they've essentially converted a liability, what they would have ordinarily burned, and are now heating their community centers. And it strikes me is that, and I think you've alluded to it, but maybe you can expound on it more, is that we still have an awful lot to learn from them, don't we?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for that, Ed. I mean, one of the interesting things, when I first went into studying the impacts from the Fort McMurray wildfire, I was so focused on impacts and understanding how the community, Indigenous communities and residents were impacted following the fire. But it was interesting to hear from many Indigenous residents that they didn't see the wildfire as necessarily as a negative thing. I mean, they did speak a lot about and shared with my research team on what the impacts were to their livelihood, to their communities, their mental health, their well-being. But they also saw that the fire was an opportunity for regrowth, to slash what was, there previously, and an opportunity to start back new again. So while it's important to keep in mind in terms of Indigenous communities and their intimate relationship to the land and what the natural environment or the earth means to them, their perspective and understanding of the fire and the impact of wildfire, it was really interesting to learn about. So they saw it as an opportunity for regrowth. They saw it as an opportunity for us to get rid of any of the existing toxins currently in the environment that were there. So there were some elements of opportunities that the wildfire can present in terms of going forward.
Another question from a viewer: just as one would not encourage settlement in flood-prone areas, are parts of North America at the point where governments are discouraging settlement in fire-prone areas, for example, the Pacific U.S. Northwest? Anybody want to take that one on?
I'm unaware of any settlement of that nature, but I do know in the States there are places that have legislated a level of prescribed fire required in certain areas to ensure that that wildfires are mitigated. But I'm not aware of anything like that.
I had a comment. I got to to speak to was invited to speak to the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers last summer, not this past summer, but this summer before. And at the time, there was a federal cabinet minister who was going around Saskatchewan and Manitoba handing out checks so that to get people out of the floodplain prone regions. And I suggest to the ministers that, unless we start learning how to live with fire, we may have to do that sometime in the future. But I don't think that we do, because I think that we can make ourselves more resilient. It's just that we can't let it go so far as California has done now. And I see that there's a better, someone said, should governments be discouraging settlement in fire-prone areas? And I probably have answered that. But does anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll weigh in, Ed. So, and just to comment with respects to Indigenous communities or First Nation communities on reserve in particular, yes, governments have been actually discouraging or trying to encourage communities to relocate elsewhere. So we actually saw this following the Fort McMurray wildfire when it came to rebuilding homes that were lost. And this actually happened a few years back in 2013 in Alberta and with southern floods, where they were encouraged to rebuild the homes away from the floodplain. And communities were concerned by that. Firstly, they weren't actually consulted or engaged in that process in terms of what the plan involved in terms of rebuilding of homes and where. And with many of the families in the communities, they're not single family unit homes, right? They live with extended families, and they live in their own, again, close to many of their family members. So relocate. Complicated.
Well, thanks everybody. This was absolutely wonderful. I think there's a number of different take-home messages. Is that the fire problem, the challenge is not going to go away. And I think that anybody who doubts that just needs to look at California right now. Prior to 2003, California did not have a wildfire problem. 17, I think now it is 20 of the worst fires ever have occurred since 2003. And that problem is migrating into other parts of the world where like Portland, where you don't expect to see fires. So I think it's going to be something that we have to learn to live with in the future. And as we heard from our guests today, the three experts, is that there is a pathway forward. I think that this is something that we can get on top of it before it overwhelms us as it has in California. And I think that we also have a country which I think, if we look south to our neighbors, is that I think we're more receptive to taking on challenges, accepting the fact that climate change is a factor, that we are also part of the problem, that this is not going to go away, and that we have to look at fire as a meteorological event that can't be stopped like a hurricane. So we've got to learn to live with fire before it really enslaves us. I don't think we'll ever be masters of fire, but there is an in-between. So I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Great questions, great presentations, and remarkably minimal technical issues. I thought I'm always fearful of these things, but thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody.